Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside David Corbin. Glad to have you with us as we explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020
How are you, Dave?
vision.
I'm doing well, Matt. Took about 6 or 7 weeks off. I don't think we were planning on that, but January
Exactly.
happens with colds and holidays and vacations, et cetera. But it's good to get back. And while we've been away, there's definitely been a lot to talk about. So looking forward to today's show.
Yeah, there has been a lot to talk about. It seems like those last couple of months, really the last couple of years maybe, of the Biden presidency kind of crawled by. We were focused on the election and not much else seemed to be happening. And then all of a sudden, a new president and a whirlwind of activity. So we're going to try to break down President Trump's first 100 days over a series of podcast episodes. That's the plan moving forward. So we are on day 18 as we record this, which is on Thursday. So Lord willing, we'll be releasing the episode on Saturday, which will be the 20th day. And so we're thinking about breaking things up into these kind of chunks of 20 days or so and looking at kind of the major themes and issues that arise during that period. And so I thought to start this off, really the key issue, the big question is the power and the energy of the executive. We've seen lots of executive orders. We've seen trial balloons with regard to the Middle East. We've seen tariffs imposed and then withdrawn. We've seen a cabinet that's gone through a lot of hearings and in many cases has been approved at this point. And so we want to take kind of a dive into executive power. Recall the term from our old political science studies of the Imperial Presidency, coined by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in the 70s in a book that was written against Richard Nixon. Schlesinger Jr. always a good partisan for the Democratic cause. But it's a term that's really gone into general usage, and so we don't have to use it the way he does. But it's certainly a nice point of contrast with the executive that we see laid out in the Constitution and described in Federalist 70, particularly in Hamilton's discussion of energy in the executive. So what we want to do is talk through those constitutional powers, lay a foundation, a framework there, and then look at the Federalist, the broader founder's understanding of what a good executive looks like, and then apply that to the day and take some of these hot button issues and kind of work through those and just see what we find. Are we talking about appropriate energy, or are we talking about a more imperial exercise of executive power?
Well, we deserve this, Matt. We asked in our last episode for a Trump administration that bit rather than barked. President Trump is still barking, but it looks like there's some bite to his activity. Maybe an imperial bite, maybe not. Let's see in this show.
Yeah, you're right. There's been a lot of bite. Very good. So let's start with the most fundamental statement on executive power, which is the opening line of Article 2, which is the executive branch's article. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 1 simply states, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. And so this is a really important starting point for any discussion of this, because one of the things that arose really over the last 110 years now with the rise of the administrative state was almost a fourth branch of government, the bureaucracy. And there's been a challenge really to the notion that the executive, the president at the head of the executive branch, really ought to be in charge of the bureaucracy. But according to our system, that's exactly as it should be. In fact, there's a great piece that was published in National Review just yesterday by Yuval Levin, who talks about the fact that, in a sense, in the Constitution, the president is the executive branch. Obviously, there's others that are brought in to carry out the president's responsibilities and to help him to do that. But the president has that unitary executive power vested in him and in his office. And so as regards the executive branch itself, the president does have and ought to have wide latitude to set policy. And of course, the old saw is, whatever you can do by an executive order can be undone by an executive order. And so we've become used to these first day mass signings of executive orders that repeal the actions of your predecessor as a new president from a new party comes in.
I think you hit upon something important in that introduction, Matt, and that is the unitary or single magistrate feature of the executive branch of American government. And Alexander Hamilton, of course, spent a long time on this subject and why you need a unitary executive in the Federalist. You need someone who you're going to grant a power to who can actually do the job of the executive, but that individual also needs to have accountability for those actions. So, all right from the get-go, I think that it's important to recognize that not only is power granted to the executive branch, but power is granted to an individual.
Right. And as you say, wherever the Constitution gives responsibility, the Constitution always has accountability. And so you have the whole process of congressional investigation, congressional funding, ultimately the power of impeachment and removal. And so it's never the case that anyone has completely isolated power or unexaminable power. But nevertheless, the executive branch powers are vested in the president, and therefore there ought to be a wide latitude for the president to act according to his own judgment in organizing and carrying out the responsibilities of that branch.
Right. So there's some complexity, however, that is added in because we don't have simply one department of government. We have three departments of government, the executive being one of three. So I think the question that Levin lays out rather nicely and answers rather nicely is what should the relationship of the executive be within his own executive branch and then vis-a-vis the other branches of government. Where is his power? What does his power look like? Is his power expansive or constrained or some hybrid of the two? So what is Levin's argument here, Matt, on framing the issue of executive power?
Well, he's got a great one line, I think, that summarizes at least the thesis of the piece. He says, a rough but useful rule of thumb would be that the president does command the executive branch, but the executive branch does not command our government. And so just as you're saying, Dave, we have a tripartite system. We have three branches of government. They each have their responsibilities. There's meant to be ambition counteracting ambition, a separation of powers system that's in place in the Constitution that's maintained by the constitutional system and the ambition that's generated through that system. And so, yeah, we recognize that the president does not have the final word on all matters related to making laws or establishing policies. These are matters for the Congress to resolve primarily, nor does the president have judicial authority. We have the Supreme Court and a whole federal judiciary. But the executive branch has vested in it certain key powers, and those are the president's powers to exercise accordingly.
And this is one of those issues to whom is power granted that makes up one of the fundamental questions of politics and is one of the fundamental themes of political history. You note from Aristotle forward that there is within governance sometimes the one who may predominate, the individual, the king, the dictator, whoever it may be, the Caesar, or the few could hold power in their hands in a way in which they took it upon themselves to rule by themselves. Or in some cases, and we see this more in the modern world, the many take up power. So what is the proper relationship between the one, the few, and the many? And in the American Republican constitutional scheme, power is granted to the one and to the few and to the many. So it's recognized that each of these three branches of government are going to want to employ the power that had been granted to them. And a good, healthy constitutional system is one, as you just mentioned, in which the ambition of one branch is countered by the ambition of another. There was no resolution or remedy for the problem, according to Madison, Hamilton, and others, in which you just said, okay, no one's going to be ambitious, or we're going to write a system that is perfect, that is based upon a human nature that can never be. Right? This Constitution is based upon human nature as they saw it, which was flawed yet educable.
And the beauty of our system is that while we have a one, a few, and a many, that one is chosen by the people, not a hereditary king, and that few chosen by the people, not a hereditary nobility. And so the many are not a rabble, but rather citizens of a republic. And so while they kept that framework in a certain sense, they republicanized it and made it a thoroughly popular government that nevertheless had the advantages of that old mixed regime.
Agreed. And the other thing that I did, think that was so essential is the glue that holds all of the ambition together is the rule of law, to which no one is above that rule of law, which is essential in discussing this relationship between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, because as Levin writes, the executive is to execute, right, faithfully execute the laws that Congress passes. That's the role. That's his role of execution. So he can't execute whatever he wants, but he executes the law as given by the Congress.
Exactly. And so as we work our way down through Article 2, we come to Section 2, which lays out some of the president's powers, most famously the commander-in-chief power over the Army and Navy, and of course, the other branches that have been added subsequently, but also power over the departments of the government, which again lays out this vision. Even the founders had a vision for some kind of executive branch beyond the president and the vice president, but one that was under the authority and reported to the president. That section concludes with the pardon power, which is also one we'll talk about a bit when we think about the use and abuse of the power, unquestionably a presidential prerogative. So there's no question that the president can pardon people for federal crimes, with one exception, cases of impeachment, which is there in the Constitution itself. But the question of how you do that in a Republican way, in a properly submissive way, you might say, to the overall system and the vision of the rule of law you were mentioning a moment ago, that's something we'll have to get into.
Yeah, and I think that Levin nicely, discusses this part of the constitutional equation as well. In asking the question, well, what can the president not do with regard to the administration of his office and the administration of his law? And he says, well, he can't do two things in particular. He can't refuse to do what the law states, right? So he can't do something different than what the law states. And he can't assume, right, to write the law where no legal authority exists. And I think those are two very important things as we kind of go through the Trump administration and the power that it'll want to employ in the first 100 days. Is it doing one of these two things that it is not constitutionally allowed to do?
Yeah, that's great. And, one of the challenges, frankly, that goes across party lines here and presidential administrations is that the Congress in recent decades has been willing to give pretty open-ended authority to the executive branch to fill in what are pretty essential details in a lot of policies. And so whereas we would say, well, that's really a lawmaking matter, you think about the a tariff rate, that seems like that's a matter of law. And yet, as we'll see, there's some real discretion that's been given to the president by the Congress. And so part of the give and take here and part of the challenge of adjudicating all this is that if you had a Congress that was doing its job, the lines of demarcation between congressional authority and executive authority might be more clear. But because the Congress has been willing, sometimes because of partisan ambition, right, which often trumps institutional ambition, has been willing to give a president of the same party perhaps powers to fill in the gaps, as it were, in a piece of legislation, well, future presidents use those gaps and they fill them in themselves as well. So that's something that we have to think about as we work our way through this, because the challenges of our system are not just executive branch challenges, but in some cases, the unwillingness of the Congress to do its job.
Well, if we were to take up then each part of Article 2 of the Constitution, would you say, Matt, that the presidential power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States has been abused or has been employed within the text of the Constitution?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's no question the power is there and there's no limits on that power. And so what we're talking about is it been used in ways that are compatible with the broader principles of our system? And I would say we have quite a few recent examples where that's not the case. So one thing that I think is not contemplated by the Constitution is blanket pardons of mass groups of people. So you don't just a whole class of people that were convicted of a certain crime and decide, hey, we don't think that was really a crime or it wasn't really that serious. We want to just commute all those sentences or pardon all those offenders. That's not how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to be a case of individual injustice as a matter of equity, Or really the case that Hamilton talks about when he defends his power is some kind of rebellion, right? And you've got a person leading an army marching to Washington, imagine. And so you negotiate, right? Some kind of pardon agreement to establish the peace. Think about Shays' Rebellion or something of that sort, right? Where you're able to use the pardon power as a way to actually quell some kind of an internal disturbance. And so it's not to be used to protect your son from the consequences of his actions. It's not to be used to defend your violent supporters who 4 years before had broken into the Capitol and violently assaulted police officers. Right? These are partisan things. These are personal things, not really the spirit of the pardon power. It should be used for national purposes. And it's a shame, and I mean literally a shame, that so many pardons are given out after presidential elections when the incumbent is leaving. These pardons would not have been issued had the president have to be accountable for them at the electoral ballot box.
Exactly. That the lack of accountability that happens when you do it in the lame duck period in between the election and when you're leaving office. Well, on the second article, section 2, paragraphs 2 through 3, the president is also given the power with the advice and consent of Senate to make treaties and to make appointments. Do you think in this case as well, within the text of the Constitution, that President Trump has done what he has granted power to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, we don't have a lot to go on. I mean, he's certainly made his nominees. Those nominees have been vetted. There was some talk about what I think would have been an abuse of the recess appointment clause before he became president. There was talk about the Congress coming into session and then immediately declaring a recess so he could put his whole cabinet in. And I don't know if that was serious, if that was a trial balloon that fizzed out or whatever. But whatever it was abandoned. And so they've gone through the normal process. There's been some, closely divided votes. Obviously, Pete Hegseth got through on a tiebreaker, and there may be one or two others that are going to have close votes coming up. But yeah, I mean, this has been the constitutional process, advice and consent. There's always going to be, I guess, some back and forth about what elements of foreign policy should be conducted through treaties versus just executive actions. And so I think there's some possibility for some more discussion and debate as, let's say, his policy toward Israel unfolds or efforts to end the war in Ukraine. But at this point, I think these are all things that are either in early stages of development, we'll have to wait and see, or it's been regular according to constitutional processes.
Which I think brings us to the section of the Constitution, Article 2, Section 3, that is probably the grayest area right now and the one that is going to have to be worked out in these upcoming months. And that's a power granted to the president, but also kind of a responsibility of the president that he take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And I think this is right. the part of this power granting to the president that is being brought into question by his political foes. Now, not everyone thinks that the first 3 weeks of his administration have been a time and place where he has not faithfully executed the laws that Congress have passed. For example, Speaker Mike Johnson, in responding to all of the president's executive orders, et cetera, and looking at the various agencies that he administers, wrote the following, that the executive branch in our system has the right to evaluate how executive branch agencies are operating and to ensure not only the intent of Congress in funding mechanisms, but also the stewardship of precious American taxpayer dollars are being handled well. That's what they're doing by putting a pause on some of those agencies and evaluating them by doing these internal audits. That is long overdue, a much welcome development. That's what the American people demand and deserve. And then goes on to say, very much kind of in the vein of Hamilton, we see this as an active, engaged, committed executive branch authority doing what the executive branch should do.
I think there's a case we made that that's what's happening so far. I think there's some questions as to where he's going with some of this, right? So you just say, well, we're going to temporarily pause funding on a project while we evaluate the project. That seems reasonable. While we evaluate the vendors we're working with, or while we consider whether or not this project is being carried out the right way. according to the intent of the Congress. All that seems very reasonable. But if you say, well, we're actually ending the project or we're not spending the money permanently, Congress appropriated $1 million for this, we're going to spend zero, that's really moving beyond the role of the executive. So when the Congress appropriates money for a purpose, it's the job of the executive to spend that money wisely, to spend it in the spirit for which it was appropriated. And there's obviously some flexibility there. There's some room for working out the best method and the timing and all that. But the appropriation itself ought to then ensure the spending that is carried out. So I think that's where we can run into trouble here, right? It's one thing to do some accountability, to do some evaluation, to do some pausing, catch your breath, bring in new people. They have to set up systems for making sure the money's not wasted. It's another thing to say, well, we're just cutting that program, even though Congress has funded it.
Yeah, it's interesting too. This brings up the question of the impounding of funds that Congress has passed, and whether it is possible, for a president to impound those funds. And there's a really great resource on this question by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities website that takes a look at what a president can and cannot do based upon longstanding constitutional restrictions for impounding monies. And impoundment simply is an action by the president to withhold funding that Congress has enacted. The problem, I think, is that, as you had mentioned before, there's some wiggle room here for the president. There's such a law called the Impoundment Control Act that allows the president to impound funds. However, that act requires that the president requires the president, if he's going to defer spending funds for up to 45 days, to make a request and to explain through a special message to Congress as to why he is impounding those funds. And if the Congress does not approve the president's rescission request, then the funds must be spent. So there is law in the books, Matt, that that suggests that kind of a standstill, taking a pause, doing an audit of something, making sure that the money is being spent correctly, is legal under this Impoundment Control Act. But as you mentioned, there's no just, okay, nope, we're not going to spend that money. It doesn't get spent because I say it doesn't get spent.
Right. And so it's an opportunity to go back to Congress and say, okay, let's take a second look at this appropriation, and Congress can change its mind. Congress can decide not to spend the money, but it's not the president's prerogative to do that.
Exactly. So, I guess that this all boils down to something that themed this whole show. Is this type of energy from the president constitutional? Is it lowercase r Republican? Or does it promise a further and further incline of the presidency towards imperialism? So I think it's helpful here to go back to the original source documents, and in this case, the Constitution and the explanation of the Constitution that's found in the Federalist, in which Hamilton takes on the question of, okay, what do we want the executive branch to do? What do we want its character to be? So this is Hamilton from Federalist 70. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. Why is energy in the executive a leading character of good government? Well, for Hamilton, it's a leading character because it's essential, one, to the protection of the community against foreign attacks, two, to the steady administration of the laws, three, to the protection of property, and four, to the security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy. So, one, we want an energetic executive because we want to defend ourselves against foreign powers that might threaten us. Two, we want the laws administered in a steady fashion. Three, we want property protected. And four, we want an executive to guard our liberty against assaults of ambition, faction, and anarchy. And interestingly here, Matt, when Hamilton gives this argument, he mentions the Roman use of a dictator against intrigues of ambitious individuals or uprisings, invasions, and all the rest. So granting and wanting energy from your executive is something that history teaches ought to be done.
What we're trying to see here is energy toward what? And you gave us those four reasons why Hamilton favors the energetic executive. Energy directed against threats from outside. Energy directed in favor of the enforcement of the laws passed by Congress. Energy directed to protect our property. Energy directed to protect our liberty. These are the fundamentals of our system. Think about the core things that we expect the government to do and the fundamental rights from the Declaration of Independence that the government's supposed to protect. And so if the executive is energetic toward those purposes, then we have one doing just its job. Now, on the other hand, if the government is energetic in other directions, right, contrary to those purposes or beyond those purposes, then Hamilton's idea doesn't so much lend it credence. So we have to think about, are these efforts of President Trump or any president that we're examining, are they directed toward these high purposes? Is that energy for the good of the people, or is it energy for other reasons?
Yeah, and here it's interesting because you had referenced Schlesinger Jr. before and his giving us the term Imperial Presidency, and for Schlesinger Jr. Writing in the 70s, his book was a response to what he believed was an abuse of war-making authority by President Nixon, and takes a look at presidents taking on greater and greater powers with regard to war-making decisions throughout American history. In this case, I don't think that the use of these executive orders per se are doing the same thing as Schlesinger was attacking Nixon and others of doing 40, 50 years ago. But it may just be the case, and there may be some areas of Trump's barking that begin to move into that arena of an imperial presidency as Schlesinger Jr. defines it. I mean, whether it's dictating what's going to happen in Gaza, renaming bodies of water from one thing to another, suggesting perhaps that other places ought to be assumed under American jurisdiction. Now, he could be fooling here. Sometimes you just don't know whether he's serious or not. Right. But some of those things seem to fall under the umbrella of imperial presidency as Schlesinger defines it, more so than these particular items that we can take up one at a time here at the end of the show.
Yeah, taking over the Panama Canal, taking over Gaza, these would be truly imperial acts. But as you say, with President Trump, you never quite know if this is a negotiating position that he's staking out. It seems like it often is, or if he's actually serious, and only time will tell.
Well, let's ask that question of energetic versus imperial and take a look at each of these, I guess, the bigger issues over the last 2 or 3 weeks. So I'll bring it up, Matt, and then give me your sense as to whether or not the Trump administration has been energetic in this case or imperial. So first item, ending DEI programs in the executive branch.
I think that's very clearly an appropriate action, not just appropriate from the standpoint of the power, but very much in keeping with our laws and our tradition. I mean, this is equal protection, the 14th Amendment. This is Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is recent Supreme Court decisions, right? So to the degree that those programs were aiming at establishing certain race-oriented policies or actions, they're simply antithetical to the principle of equality that are at the base of our system. And so for the president to come in and to end those was, I think, an appropriate act. And certainly insofar as that's reach is the executive branch itself, all the more so.
Pardoning of all the January 6 defendants, or on the other hand, President Biden's pardon of his family.
Yeah, I think I've already suggested, I think both of those are probably inappropriate uses of the pardon power. So I think this is not meant to be a way of protecting your friends and your family on your way out the door. And while there were certainly some cases that probably could bear some careful scrutiny among the January 6 defendants, a blanket pardon for all of them, I don't think is in the spirit of the pardon and probably not deserved in many cases.
We've covered impounding funds at various agencies. So there is set out by federal law an opportunity for the president to do that within some constraints. I think an interesting case is this order declaring only 2 genders and prohibiting male athletes from competing in women's sports in colleges receiving federal money, the language of Title IX, Matt, reads, "No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." It would seem to me that that clause, on the basis of sex, is essential to this question, because if there is such a thing as sex and the law is based upon the basis of sex, then declaring that there are two sexes seems to be common sense.
And even necessary, right? We have to define our terms. But even beyond that, it was clearly a misuse of Title IX to then turn sex into gender and then bring in all the modern gender theory, which posits however many genders there happen to be on a given day, and then turn that entirely on its head so that women were now competing against males in college athletics and on the basis of a requirement they were claiming under this very title meant to protect women in sports.
Exactly. So I think that this is obviously a reversal of President Obama's administration's policies when he got into office in redefining sex as gender and then opening up gender to all of these various definitions. But I think that, once again, I would say that this is fully in line with his constitutional authority.
Right.
All right, here's a more difficult one. Ending birthright citizenship. I think there are a couple of arguments to be made here, and there are some really fine arguments to be made on both sides. But what's your general take on the notion that the president could end birthright citizenship?
Well, I think I would separate two questions here. One is, can the president do it? And the other one is it actually a constitutional mandate? And so I think it's a fair reading of the 14th Amendment to raise the question as to whether or not birthright citizen is actually intended by the 14th Amendment's language, because there's a clause there that's very clearly recognizing sort of a carve out for those that are subject to the authority of another country. And so we could argue that somebody who's in the United States illegally or under other purposes unrelated to legal immigration or just a natural born citizen is perhaps subject to another government's authority and therefore not somebody within the cognizance of that clause. So that's a fair question that I think we have to work out. But I don't think it's an appropriate use of executive power to simply attempt to settle the question by executive decree. So I think that's where President Trump has gone wrong. And I would say the same thing about the effort of President Biden in the last days of his administration to declare all of a sudden that the ERA amendment had been ratified based on a tweet. And so these are things that have to be adjudicated or worked out. There's a separation of power system, as we talked about earlier. I don't think it's enough for the president to declare the end of birthright citizenship.
Yeah, it's interesting in this case. I remember when I was in my mid-20s or late 20s, I'd already served in the New Hampshire House of Representatives. And for whatever reason, my dad did not go to the consulate in London when I was born there. My mother's British.
Yeah.
So I didn't have any citizenship papers. And when I was naturalized, finally in my late 20s, I had to declare allegiance to the United States and that I was not subject to the jurisdiction of another country in very clear terms. I mean, I had to confirm that. So it seems to me that's a very strong argument that clause is intended to exclude a certain type of person who is here. However, on the other side of the argument, one case that's not been brought up too much, but a court case, United States versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898, the Supreme Court took up this question of the meaning and intent of the 14th Amendment and argued, quote, "The Constitution affirms the ancient and fundamental rule of citizenship by birth within the territory." Now, it's a little more complex than that because they did make an allowance for certain individuals that were outside of that definition of the law. But certainly there is some constitutional history, some jurisprudence that backs the notion that this has been the broader definition of birthright citizenship has been the one understood by the American judiciary. So, Matt, I think the last interesting item regarding presidential power is this discussion around tariffs, especially those that have been imposed and then recently lifted on Canada and Mexico. I found it interesting that Senator from Virginia, Tim Kaine, along with Senator Coons from Delaware, another Democrat senator, they both introduced what's called the Stable Trade Policy Act. But what's interesting about the act that they're introducing, the legislation they're introducing, is that they acknowledge that currently the president does have the authority to impose tariffs on any nation using the powers granted to him in Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act. So what I find nice about this, good about this, constitutional about this is Kaine and Coons recognizing, right, that the president has been granted this authority, so he's legally allowed to do this. What's the remedy to his legal allowance to do this? Well, to write new law, to pass a new act that would reverse his ability to do so. So regardless of the merits of passing tariffs or not, it seems Kaine and Coons in this case want to act within the confines of American constitutional law.
Yeah, I agree with that. And that's great. When I think about tariff policy, I go back my old studies of the Jacksonian period and the debates between Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson over the tariff, and John Calhoun, the tariff of abominations that led to a crisis, almost broke up the Union back in the 1830s, long before the Civil War. And those policies were all really Congress set policies. Congress was setting tariff rates. Were they too high? Were they too low? Which goods? Right? All that was a matter of congressional discussion. And of course, the president would weigh in on that, the wisdom of this, and have his own ideas about the best policy. But it was clearly a Congress-driven matter. It was a matter of taxation. And so tax bills, of course, come from Congress, not from the president. But what happened, as you were mentioning, in 1974 was all of a sudden Congress said to the president, well, you can impose tariffs as a matter of basically a tool of foreign policy. And so you can say, well, there's a crisis in our relations with the nation. And so to respond to that crisis, we need to impose emergency tariffs, as it were. And so, of course, you can see the value of that as a tool of foreign policy. We can see why that would be better, perhaps, than a hot war or other kinds of conflict. And so you can see why there could be some wisdom in having some discretion on a president's part. But, of course, you can also see how that could be abused by a president who sort of gins up a crisis or announces a crisis that maybe not quite within the spirit of the law as it was originally designed. And so I think what the senators you mentioned, Kaine and Coons, are trying to do is create a law that puts something of the genie back in the bottle and say, okay, we're still going to have a power to impose emergency tariffs in actual emergencies when there's a real crisis that can be addressed by this tool as among the various tools the executive branch can use in addressing a foreign policy situation. But we're not going to use it as merely another matter of policy where the president all of a sudden is deciding, I think tariffs are important, therefore I'm going to sort of gin up a crisis and come up with a reason why all of a sudden Canada is a threat to the United States. And therefore I can impose tariffs at whatever rate I decide based upon my individual judgment that threat exists.
Well, one power that he hasn't assumed yet and placed within an executive order that I want him to is related to NFL football. I would love, and I know this is in the Constitution, I don't think anyway, him to require the NFL to put microchips in all of its footballs so that referees can't give games to the Chiefs moving forward.
Josh Allen would agree. All my old Parks family relatives that still live in the Orchard Park area would definitely agree.
I say that as a merely neutral observer, not as a Patriots fan who does not want the Patriots' legacy overcome by the Chiefs. But that brings us to Tocqueville's crystal ball, and we've got the big game on Sunday, Super Bowl Sunday. So this isn't a crystal ball. This is maybe it is a crystal ball for you, but what one appetizer would you most want to eat on Super Bowl Sunday, Matt? So what are you asking Rachel to cook up for Sunday's Super Bowl?
Oh, our food restrictions are such that that's probably going to be something I'm imagining rather than actually enjoying. Okay. But you know what I would enjoy is a good potato skins, kind of heaped with the cheddar cheese and the bacon bits and that kind of thing. That's as hors d'oeuvres go, that's probably at the top of my list. How about yourself?
Like it. We've since we've lived in Texas, we've definitely embraced the queso culture. So nice. Most of these games, we have some sort of queso and Tex-Mex or Mexican theme to the event. So you can't go wrong. Should be fun. Always a fun day, and looking forward to it. Should be a great Super Bowl. So the real crystal ball.
Yep.
Let me ask you this: who wins, the Eagles or the Chiefs? Why do they win? And who is the MVP? And I'll do the same after I hear yours and make my prediction based upon yours.
All right. So Chiefs are a 1.5-point favorite, which I think is reasonable given the history and the context. Obviously, Mahomes' incredible track record in the playoffs. But I'm going to take the Eagles. Fly, Eagles, fly. This is for Josh Blander out there and the broader Blander clan. I think the Eagles win this 28-24. And Saquon Barkley goes for 200 yards, 3 touchdowns, and is the MVP. Saquon's been my guy since he was at Penn State. I thought he would come into the league. I thought he would be the greatest running back in NFL history. And unfortunately, the New York Giants offensive line has maybe kept that from being the case. But he might have the best single season in NFL history. And so I'd love to see him cap it off with a Super Bowl MVP and a big win for the Eagles.
So I'm only going to show this to you because we're taping this on Zoom. But what is my prediction there? What does it say if you can see it there on my sheet of paper?
I see 28-24. Are you kidding me?
28-24 Eagles. Who's my MVP?
You got to hold it. Oh, the offensive line of the Eagles.
Well,
no, Saquon Barkley.
MVP.
All right.
So I'm in absolute agreement with you. I had that prediction prior to hearing yours. So we have the same prediction.
Wow.
28-24. Saquon Barkley as the MVP.
Sorry,
really
Josh.
That dominant Eagles offensive line coming into play here. Ball control. I think the Eagles will get out to a lead in the game, which I think they'll need to. And I think, Mahomes is magical. He's amazing. Perhaps he comes one drive, one touchdown short of winning the game. And I think here also the Eagles defensive backfield, which has been a sore spot for Eagles fans over the last 3 or 5 years, is now much improved. And I think they make a big play at the end. Eagles win. Barkley takes home the MVP. And everyone in Philadelphia is happy. Except, I hope, for the person who keyed my car when the Patriots were playing the Eagles and we lived in Philadelphia. So I'm not wishing a good day on that person, but everyone else in Philadelphia.
And that was, unfortunately, totally unnecessary since the Eagles won that game.
Exactly. So that was before the game. So
yeah.
Stupid me for having my Patriots license plate.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. The wrong part.
I was warned. So anyway, but should be a great game, and it's always a great time. So hopefully you and I in our next show a couple weeks from now, when we focus on the second 20 days of President Trump's first 100 days, we'll get to see that our prediction is correct. So
yeah, it's a little scary, honestly, for us both to be picking the same team and the same score. So I do feel a little bad for Josh.
We need the microchip in the ball. That's the most important.
We need the microchip. Let's start the campaign.
Okay.
You, the DIA Today audience, can make this happen. We know we have friends in high places, so let's get it done.
Get it done. All right, Matt. Have a great weekend.
Yeah, you too. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. As always, you can reach us at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com. We'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
2020 vision.